Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear and see me well. My name is Camille Richardson, and I am the Vice President for Women's Empowerment at Counterpart International. And on behalf of Counterpart International, which is a global NGO, which works with community leaders around the world to find sustainable solutions to development challenges, we are so pleased to be here with you today to continue a conversation which we started last month in honor of Women's History Month. So I joined Counterpart to help Counterpart build out their women's empowerment practice. Our CEO, Dr. Ann Hudak, has made a visionary executive decision to make Counterpart International have women's empowerment as a central offering of what we're up to in the world today. And so for Women's History Month last month, we launched a new series of conversations on the role of women in the blue and green economies and why that's important. So we wanted to bring you this session here today at the Strategic International Development Conference to continue that conversation with more experts in the field who are here to share their perspectives and to talk about what's going on in the world today and perhaps what we might want to consider moving forward, why it matters, and what are some potential solutions to some of the challenges that we're finding. One challenge I think we went through very recently was that of the COVID global pandemic, where a very small virus, microscopic, just brought the world to a screeching halt. It didn't discriminate in who it impacted, although women were perhaps among those who were most widely impacted and most vulnerable, but it didn't really discriminate in who it impacted and why. I know I had COVID, probably a lot of people in your lives, had COVID, but I think there were a lot of silver lining and gifts from that whole experience. And I think one lesson we probably took from this is the value of human life. How, whether we're male or female, we're all on this planet together, and that our planet is fragile. And it is something that we get to be stewards of, that we get to take care of, and we get to work together to do it. So we've had an opportunity over the past 3 years to consider that. And we also have an opportunity moving forward after this reset of going through this global pandemic together to reconsider how we're going to redesign how we coexist on this planet with each other. And let's look at some of the evidence-based facts. For over a decade, it's been confirmed that supporting women's economic participation is good for the world. It's good for business. It's good development practice. And a recent IMF study shows that fully eliminating gender gaps in emerging economies could add 23% to GDP in those countries that make that decision. So it's good governance as well. And world participation of women alongside men in the rapidly developing blue and green economies is key to taking those economies forward faster. So there is a high demand, there's a growing demand for workforce in both the green and the blue economies, with job postings growing 8% per year, according to LinkedIn. Yet women only hold 29% of the 80 million jobs in the green economy globally. And let me just pause and say, we probably all know what it is, but just for the record, the green economy tends to have to deal with land, with agriculture, in terms of food systems. It has to deal with energy, in terms of land-based energy forms. And of course, the blue economy has to deal with oceans. So, we're going to be framing that for our conversation today. We're also seeing high investments in both the green and the blue economies and in green and blue businesses. So, for example, Bloomberg reported a record $755 billion in venture capital investments in energy transition technologies in 2021. And that represents a 27% increase from the year before. However, women's businesses made up only a tiny fraction of the recipients of that investment. Luckily for us, governments around the world are really paying attention to these trends and to this problem. And the US government, for example, has launched a Women in the Sustainable Economy Initiative, also known as WISE. We love our acronyms in government. I came from a 30-year government career with the Commerce Department, so every agency has its own alphabet soup, but WISE is a pretty good acronym. And state launched this back in 2023. And they've been able to galvanize $1.2 billion in commitments from governments around the world, as well as private sector companies, which is outstanding. Yet, we also know, according to the United Nations Women International Trade Center, that only 1% of all government procurement, including in the blue and green economy in terms of sector development initiatives, that only 1% goes to women's businesses. So there's a disconnect clearly that we're going to talk about here today and think about some solutions, and certainly invite all of you to participate in the conversation and bring your brain power and expertise to think about how we move forward in a really collaborative partnership together. So this is now the time to introduce the meat on the sandwich, the speakers who have joined us today to share their time and energy and expertise with us. The first person I'm going to introduce, and hopefully you can bring her up on camera front and center, would be Saudat Salami, who is the founder of the Saudat Salami Foundation, and she is joining us today online from Lagos, Nigeria. And she was actually an alumna. She is an alumna of Counterpart International and ExxonMobil's Global Women in Management program. And she's done tremendous work in both the blue economy and in e-commerce. She's dealt with, food and sustainable fashion, and she promotes transformational development and sustainable business programs for women and youth in Africa. She has initiatives like a personal home shopping business and a growing your own food business. And she's used those two initiatives to empower over 300 women and stay-at-home moms to set up and digitize home businesses in the food sector across the continent of Africa, which is amazing. So aside from the Global Women in Management, she has also participated in the African Women Entrepreneurship Cooperative, or AWEC, and in the State Department's U.S. International Visitor Leadership Program, and in the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women Scholarship initiative. So she is an expert. She is an outstanding person in her field. And she also recently joined us as a co-sponsor of our Women in the Blue and Green Economy event last month. I'd also like to introduce next Isabel Beltran Villavicencio, who is the Managing Director at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet at the Rockefeller Foundation, but is also supported by the IKEA Foundation and the Bezos Earth Fund. And she leads work in Latin America and the Caribbean, focusing on universal energy access, green economies, and energy transition. And before that, she was the director of the Power Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation, working on energy and resilience projects in Latin America. She has more than 15 years of experience in economic development, having worked at the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And I'd also like, rounding out our panel is Paula Tavares. She is a senior legal gender specialist at the World Bank today, where her work focuses on promoting gender-informed laws and policies and advising member countries on implementing regulatory reforms in support of gender equality, women's economic inclusion, and private sector development. She leads regional and country-level programs covering Africa and Latin America toward improving the enabling environment with a cross-cutting equity and inclusion lens. She's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and an adjunct professor of gender and international and comparative law at American University in their Washington College of Law. So we have some amazing experts, speakers here with us today, and I want to rush right in and kick this off and get things going by starting off with specific questions for each of our panelists, and then we'll move to group questions. So let's start with Saudat. You can bring Saudat up on the screen. So Saudat, given your dual role in servicing both the blue and the green economies in businesses and training women entrepreneurs in this sector, what are some of the critical investments that are needed and partnerships that are needed to enhance the success of women-led initiatives in the blue economy?
Thank you very much, Camille. Hi, everybody from everywhere you are. Well, three things come to mind quickly. First of all, I want to talk about capacity building and mentorship. I remember in the last conference, that you talked about, the blue economy that Counterpart hosted, we agreed that a lot of women do not even know that they're in this sector. They do not understand what the sector is. So that means that there's a lot of money on the table that they are not accessing. One of the reasons why it's only 1% of women accessing those funds. They do not understand what this sector is about. They do not understand how to standardize their practice. So we need to link them to capacity building. We need to, and there are two groups of women in this sector that need capacity building. The entrepreneurs, right, that clearly need business skills that are tailored to this sector, that clearly need us to give them technology that they need in this sector. And they also need access to sustainable practices. But then there are another group of women that will feed into the employment pool. There are a lot of companies in this blue economy that do not have barriers of entry. But because there's no pool of trained women, they cannot employ women to diversify their workforce. So there are training organizations, institutions, vocational centers, skill acquisition centers that have courses for this sector. We need to encourage women to enroll so that we can have a pool of qualified women that will serve as a pipeline for these companies in the sector, in the blue economy sector. So we have the entrepreneurs that can work with established institutions like the AWEC that are part of, which can tailor training for that sector. Then we have the established vocational institutions that can train our women as well. Because a lot of people want to employ based on merit, and they also want to diversify their workforce. But if there is no pool of trained women, they will not just employ just because they want to tick the diversity quota. So that is one. Secondly, we should be looking at access to finance. Access to finance is a problem for everybody. But what we need to understand is that for women in this sector and people in this sector, almost everything is experimental. A lot of things are experimental. So we need a lot of grants for these women. And the capacity building will also help position them to be able to write grants and access these grants and even know that these grants are available. Because for everything that we know and we discussed in that conference, the data supports already, they are all data that support that diversity has its benefits. But and there's a lot of money out there, nobody is accessing it, 1%. It's because they don't know it, and it's because they don't know how to package themselves for it. So that is very critical. Then again, we're looking at women that already have proof of concept. They've passed the experimental stage. So we're now looking at impact investors, VCs, to create a fund that will target this sector, specialized funds for this sector, for the women. So the grants, because they are very experimental right now, then impact investment, then of course microloans. A lot of women, if you look at the businesses of women, and Nigeria has one of the largest entrepreneurs in the world, women entrepreneurs in the world. And a lot of our businesses are around food and fashion and jewelry and accessories. And if you look at a lot of women that are also in the coastal area, that is what they're doing, jewelry and fashion. I can give you an example of a lady in Nigeria. I'm from Ekpe in Lagos State, which is the coastal area of Nigeria. And we have this very invasive aquatic weed in the ocean. And it's very destructive. So you find a number of the fishermen and the women in the area, once the season is a high season, this weed destroys the boats, it destroys the fishing net, it destroys their aquatic life. Now, this lady, her name is Acheyon Adachaba, if I get her name correctly. She looked at this problem and she decided to, provide a solution. She harvests this weed, she dries it, she turns it into a rope, and she uses it to create beautiful, beautiful accessories and jewelry and household furniture and all sorts of things. She's still at the experimental stage, and she needs funding, she needs grants, and it is really, really helping the environment, because you can imagine all the women in the coastal area, if they can be trained in this kind of way, they will be able to, in the high season of the weed, they will look at it as a plus for them because they will have materials to harvest and create furniture and beautiful things. And in the low season, they will fish and they'll sell fish. So it is so important for us to give them capacity building and access to loans and grants. Then finally, we need to look at market access. Market access and networking is critical. Sales is the beginning and end of any business. It doesn't matter the product or the service or the value you're providing. If you cannot sell and if there's no market for what you're producing, you have no business. So we have to look at opportunities and platforms, e-commerce platforms, initiative where we can link international global market, where we can link this to markets. There is an initiative in Kenya. It's called the Ethical Fashion Alliance Initiative. Very brilliant initiative that links women artisans to international markets. And it focused in East Africa. And I think Afghanistan and Haiti is also part of it. Now, this initiative is a subset of a global initiative, which is the UN Fashion Alliance Initiative. The beauty about this is that, we are all in the coastal areas, but we have different cultures in the coastal areas. We have different businesses in the coastal areas. And it is not the kind of fish you find in my area in Epe that you're going to find in Venezuela or wherever. So we need to take an initiative like the UN Fashion Initiative and localize it like the Ethical Fashion Initiative for Kenya. We need so much of that to showcase our women, to give them a platform to sell, to give them a platform to share their ideas, and also to see the opportunities that are available to them. Because people are in this business, in this sector, without knowing they're in the sector. The funds are on the table and nobody is getting the funds. They are supposed to be cleaning the environment because they don't even know that their business is really cleaning the environment. So you find them recycling and also creating waste while they're recycling. So they are creating furniture with the recycled waste, but they are also creating serious waste for the environment. And that is because they do not know the impact of the business they are running, and they do not have the sustainable tools and the technology to do it right. So it is so important. For three things, like I mentioned, the capacity building and networking, access to finance, and market access and networking. Very critical for the women and the youths in this sector, both for entrepreneurs and those for business owners.
What I'm hearing as a common theme in all of this, Saudat, is it's just education all around, all along, whether you're a person in business or a young person or an organization even, or a bank. We could basically take what's going on in these coastal cities and create circular economy initiatives that would benefit the environment, benefit the community, generate prosperity, and potentially become business models for other nations to consider as part of a network.
Definitely, and it's sustainable. It is a very sustainable way of looking at it because education, if you are educated, and informed, you will be able to use the resources available to you, and you'll be able to scale your business and grow. There's no need reinventing the wheel. A network allows you to mix with people that have gone through what you've gone through and share their ideas so that you can replicate what they have done in another clime in your clime. And you can collaborate with fashion, collaborate with interior design, collaborate with energy, collaborate with coal and alternative sources of energy. No reason for us to start reinventing it, but there's no platform because people are not even aware that they're in this.
I love that. And I love the idea of creating a global collaboration network for sharing ideas and coming up with new ones. So let me move on to Paula. And because nothing happens, I'm sorry, not Paula, Isabel, my apologies. I skipped ahead of myself. Nothing happens without energy. We need energy to live. We need energy to function. So can you, Isabel, talk to us about the experience of women in this fast-growing renewable energy sector, also known as the green economy, and what roles could be created to drive sustainable infrastructure development, energy production, and distribution?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Camille. I think this is a fascinating topic. My organization focuses on renewable energy and energy access. And so the role of women is fundamental in both sides. So from one side, we have the women as beneficiaries of the energy projects, right? And the role that they should play to make these projects more sustainable in the long term, more bankable, and more effective. So there's very strong evidence and lots of studies in the economic development and business sector that says, energy, having energy is one of the fastest ways out of poverty. And especially from India, that conventional access to energy really benefits women in a higher rate than, I guess, men in terms of being able to take employment outside their homes and increasing productivity. So women as beneficiaries is a very, very important very important part of the work. So it's not really about how they benefit, but also how do we maximize those benefits by making sure that that the design of these projects really takes into account the point of view and the need of women. This makes sure that the projects are actually sustainable, especially when we're talking about the increase of renewable energy use and productive uses. And this is tied to what Saudat was saying, is like, what are the types of things that we are doing in these projects that allow women to access and benefit from this new energy at the same rate that men do. So for example, appliance financing, technical capacity for business development, especially when we're talking about activities that are energy-based, but closely tied to, like, for example, the agricultural sector. So how do we help these women with business skills? As I said, with appliance financing, with understanding a little bit more value chains and market access to make sure that these are the entrepreneurs and the businesses that are flourishing. We have some examples. For example, in Haiti, we're working with the Foncosé Foundation, focusing on how do we make sure that the uptake of this renewable energy benefits women, and how can we provide appliances and what appliances are needed. But also with the MasterCard Foundation, we have a program in Nigeria and Ethiopia looking at energizing basically women and youth in the agricultural food systems, targeting really milling and cold storage, and thinking about how we can improve the incomes of specifically young women. What are the business models that work? How can we reduce the cost of equipment? How can we strengthen energy service enterprises? So that's the one side. And then in the other side, we have, as you say, the green economy that is growing. We have this new renewable energy sector is expanding basically the economy. And how do we make sure that in this expansion, women are represented? So because employment in this new growing green economy has great potential. But for example, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, says that the clean energy sector will produce about 19 million new jobs. But currently, only 32% of those full-time jobs are being held by women. So how do we fight against those disparities now? Gogla has also estimated that the off-grid solar could generate 1.3 million jobs in Southeast Asia and East and West Central Africa. But under the current hiring trends, only 27% of those jobs will be women. So there's the other side of how can we make sure that women represent a higher percentage of the technical positions and STEM jobs. And what do we need to do about that? And we see amazing networks forming all over. I'm going to just present two examples from Latin America. We have the Secretary of Energy in Panama, really making an effort with international donors like the Inter-American Development Bank, working on the Solar Champions or Campeones Solares program, where they're actually targeting women to be installing and operating and maintaining solar systems in rural areas. This has proven to be incredibly successful in terms of not only providing them with technical skills and leadership and training, that women become agents of change in their communities and have a leadership role, but also in the long-term sustainability of the projects. I mean, go figure, women are really good at taking care of the systems and making sure that they are well managed. I don't think that's news to any of us women, but being it applied so targetedly to these energy projects has been incredible to see and incredible to gather the outcomes of these. We also have networks of women, Voz Experta in Mexico, gathering only women and creating basically rosters of women. So when people say there's not enough women, technical women to occupy these high-level positions or technical roles in the renewable energy industry, they basically come out and say, here's the list of 2,000 women that are qualified for this. There's a similar example in Brazil, and so you see like women organizing also and trying to highlight the issue of there not being enough labor supply is wrong, is that our hiring practices are not designed to attract and select women, and so also there's a lot to be done in that sector. So I think these are two clear examples of like the things that need to happen. We need to think about women as beneficiaries and how to make sure they're benefiting, not only because it's good, but also because that is what creates economic empowerment. It's not only a good thing to do, it's actually a strategic business decision. And also women as part of this new economy and expanding labor force where women cannot be left behind. There's plenty of other examples, but I'm sure we want to discuss with the rest of the panel. That's what I wanted to share today.
Thank you, Isabel. And again, I'm hearing this theme of the need for education, whether it's educating women and girls in the STEM field so that they're able to step up into these positions that are becoming available as the opportunities arise in the sector. But it's also educating organizations on hiring and being aware of bias, and not necessarily being willing to take the extra step or do the extra work to find or cultivate women for these positions. So another educational sort of linkage here. Okay, so thank you for that. So Paola, turning to you, because nothing happens without money, nothing. And the World Bank works in both the green and the blue economies, in both the public and the private sectors, to develop opportunities. And, right now we're between the climate conferences known as COP. We just came out of COP27, I believe. We're going into COP28. At the last COP conference, governments around the world committed hundreds of billions of dollars to doing something about impacts on the climate, impacts on the planet, what we're seeing going on around the world, and to foster the growth of these blue and green economies. So what are some of the key policies that the World Bank has seen that governments around the world are developing? And that's the first part of the question. So that's on the public side. And then on the second part of the question, on the private side, what are some of the key interventions that the World Bank has made with the private sector that have a transformational impact across both sectors?
Thank you, Camille, and it's a pleasure to be here on this panel and discussing a little bit of the work that we've been doing. As you mentioned, we are one of the largest sources of development finance, but also a knowledge bank and provision of technical assistance. So working, I think, across the board, both on the public side and on the private sector side in this area. And there's been a growing understanding, I think, and increasing work emerging from the World Bank on the fact that gender and climate change are fundamentally connected, right? And the promoting green, resilient, and inclusive development and private sector development and growth requires really addressing both challenges together. So this means, understanding and addressing the gender differentiated impacts of climate shocks, climate action, so the policies and interventions that are being put in place, but also women's role and leadership in climate action. So thinking about the shocks, we know that climate change disproportionately affects women and girls, and this has been increasingly discussed. Women are more exposed, have less resilience to climate variability, to stresses, to shocks. They're more likely than men to earn a living from natural resource-based activities and climate vulnerable sectors, and some of the key sectors that the green transition kind of is working on: agriculture, energy, disaster risk reduction, forestry, water. And that oftentimes their lower asset base and some of these constraints affect their resilience and their food security. And raising also risks of gender-based violence and other extreme impacts. On the impacts of climate actions, we know that the climate policies impact men and women differently and oftentimes create winners and losers. In terms of the opportunities that are created, these are not always, as has already been mentioned here by the other panelists, created equally and felt equally by men and women. Oftentimes because of unequal access to new opportunities in green economies. So we know, for example, that the green transition drives the demand for STEM skills and oftentimes investment in traditionally male-dominated sectors and professions such as energy, manufacturing, construction, transport, and has also implications in some of these areas in infrastructure, urban planning, and services. On the other hand, there's a huge also understanding of the role of women's empowerment and leadership on climate action, knowing that women can facilitate the transition to low carbon economies, can improve resource management, promote environmental stewardship, increase resilience, and that women's role in green entrepreneurship and their perspectives on green technologies and climate solutions can and should be leveraged to benefit all. So this requires addressing these different challenges really requires placing gender to some extent and gender concerns at the center and integrating climate action and efforts to close gender gaps, right? So beyond addressing the disproportionate effects, it's acknowledging that women are invaluable change makers in climate action, as I think has been highlighted here. So enhancing their access to green jobs and skills, providing adaptive social safety nets, livelihood diversification, addressing some of the issues, especially in the key systems that are involved, right? So we mentioned energy, agriculture, food, water, land management, transport, manufacturing. So addressing some of these, for example, women know that women face systemic disadvantages often in accessing jobs, income, resources, finance, information in some of these areas. And that's why the impacts are greater on women. These barriers reduce their adaptive capacity, their participation in mitigation solutions, and disaster preparedness and response. So efforts to strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity should recognize the different needs and really engage women in building resilience. So some of the areas that we've seen are complementary, for example, cash transfer programs in countries with productive inclusion measures on green and gender-sensitive public works, in farming systems, promoting women's access to agricultural extension, climate smart farming techniques, productive assets, and others. Ensuring women's control over factors of production. It's not always the case in many countries and many places, but assets to improve investments and their access to technologies. And involving women in preparing for emergencies and disaster risk management. In terms of addressing the impacts of climate action, really ensuring that the new opportunities that created will benefit women, right? And this requires an intentional mix of gender inclusive policies and interventions. Understanding, for example, that women's contributions, workforce participation, decision-making power are unequal. And that really many of these advancements in climate technologies and new green jobs are unlikely to benefit women the same way unless we do something intentionally to ensure that they are included. So really ensuring that economic diversification efforts can create livelihood opportunities for women. This includes reskilling. I think some of the areas mentioned here, right? So capacity building, training, facilitating women's entry into male-dominated fields, including STEM and some other areas, supporting women's employment and entrepreneurship. I mean, this is a barrier in general, but especially in some of these areas through ensuring that there's childcare support, there are financial and digital services, inclusion, there's access to information, and overall reducing some of the discriminatory barriers. And then really addressing women's empowerment and leadership in climate action. So knowing that the results are obviously positive, this has been mentioned here, that women's participation in climate change responses is associated with better outcomes, resource governance, conservation outcomes, disaster readiness, women's participation when we talk about ministerial and corporate decision-making bodies is also associated with more effective climate action. And in the private sector, we know that diversifying corporate boardrooms and C-suites is shown to lead to more climate-friendly policies, right? So engaging women really as agents of change. So ensuring that women's voices and leadership are incorporated into climate governance at the local and national level, into multilateral climate dialogues in the private sector, ensuring women's participation in community platforms, introducing incentives for businesses to encourage female management, but also in female employment in male-dominated sectors. Really sourcing from, and we mentioned this, right? Really the access to procurement, so sourcing from, providing finance to women-led businesses, and really empowering throughout this whole ecosystem. So some of these emerging points, policies and regulatory frameworks through our work, really some of the areas, I mean, I think overall, applying a gender lens across all climate programs and policies, that's some of the work that we've been doing. So fully integrating the gender element into creating climate response programs to ensure that they are inclusive, they drive toward the both objectives of closing gender gaps and addressing climate change. Supporting participatory practices in climate dialogue, so ensuring that women are included really in shaping the policy, shaping the investment priorities of locally led climate action, and promoting women's leadership. This across the board, right? So in climate policy and planning and implementation, in governments, in local community organizations, and in the private sector and corporate boards and management. And also, I mean, in terms of the private sector, really the IFC has been encouraging private sector initiatives that really acknowledge the intersection of gender and climate and can leverage climate finance to support women in leadership and employment and entrepreneurship. So projects, for example, IFC investment services with both climate and gender lens as key impact themes have increased from 3.5% of new commitments in 2020 to 12% in 2023. So really kind of driving some of that. And then in some specific areas in terms of promoting women's leadership in the private sector, there's, I mean, in all these areas, there's both research looking at what works, what doesn't work, but also initiatives such as Climate to Equal that encourage private sector players to support women's contributions to corporate climate action, on ensuring women's employment in the private sector. So initiatives supporting expansion of workforce gender diversity and women's leadership in green sector with some specific programs, and sustainability linked loans to improving some of these sectors that also have a gender lens. So having specific targets for promoting women's employment, for example. And on entrepreneurship, we partner with financial institutions, that's on the private sector side, to close financing gaps specifically for women-led SMEs through some of our programs, such as our Banking on Women program, and supporting also green and gender bonds through investments. And so some of these, linking these areas in some of our finance work. I think those are some of the key areas that we've seen through our work and some of the interventions that we've been focusing on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, Paula. That's a lot. It's a full body of work. And I want to open this up for some questions from our audience. I see that we had one that started early on for Saudat, but I'm going to take the question and expand it for everybody. And while I do that, I want to encourage everyone who's participating, let's start the collaborative process now. Put your name, your organization, your email, your interest in this topic, what you're up to in the chat. This is something we used to do when I was back at the Commerce Department, and we had created a women's empowerment initiatives, and the chat would just light up. And it was a really great way to start the networking. So since we're all here online and we might be scattered throughout the world, this is a wonderful opportunity we should not lose or walk away from. But so while you guys are doing that, I'm going to start with the first question I saw from Nora. I don't want to mess up your last name. It looks like it's Abdullahu. Sorry if I butchered that. And her question is essentially applied to microfinancing, but I think it can apply across the board to access, to capacity building, to financing, to selection. How do you overcome societal pushback, cultural pushback on women-led initiatives or on giving more women access? You know, there's a tendency, I think, in our minds as human beings to resist change and to see, and sometimes unfortunately to see, well, if you're getting something, that means that I'm losing something. And I think we all are very much committed to this being a win-win for everybody in order to have a better world. So what do you think about that in terms of how to approach, as we're approaching institutional bias, as we're approaching societal bias, cultural bias? Perhaps the husband is that happy that his wife is going out and doing all these things, but the world is changing. So what do you all think? I'm going to start with Saudat in terms of, since the question was addressed to you, how do we essentially go about recruiting male allies in this effort?
Yes, Camille. First of all, there's an unconscious bias we all have to agree on. Whether it's cultural, I don't know. It's have been there for a while. And we all have to agree that when we talk about getting into the room, men think that we want them out. We just want to extend the table. I don't know of any intervention that is for women that does not think, and this platform has shown it, that everybody first of all talks about education, because every fund for women always comes with capacity building, because they just have this idea that, you know, you're not informed, right? It's like you're in a boardroom and a woman makes she makes a contribution, and you know, is not acknowledged. But a man makes the same contribution, and everybody goes like, "Oh yes, oh yes." So there's an unconscious bias we have to look at, right? Then we also have to do women themselves, because a lot of women come battle ready as well, like they want to fight the men. Men created the workspace. They created the workspace, and everybody has now agreed that diversity is very important, especially if your customers are diverse. There's no way you can give your customers the best if your kitchen is not filled with diverse mindsets. And we have the data for that. I'm not going to come with the data. The data is old for that. But the unconscious bias is not allowing this to enter. There are so many initiatives that we need the men to be in the room. We are talking to ourselves. There's an echo chamber. So you're having women conferences about how we're going to move forward, and the people that we're supposed to be convincing are not in the room. So they are only reading our white paper, right? But sometimes we need to hear them out and let them know that we are not taking your job. We're just extending the table, and this thing is supposed to be richer when we're in the room. Right? That is the major thing, whether it comes to education or access to finance, because even access to finance, a number of these, they do not believe that you can handle a lot of cash. I ran a business for 20-something years, and I know that even a relative of mine wanted to give some money and was like, "Oh, I held it for you because I didn't want you to hold, I didn't want you to have so much money." I said, "Do you know how much money I control in my company? That you're holding just how much? You don't want to, you want to give me piecemeal because you don't think I can handle what?" That bias is in their mind that, oh, you cannot handle a lot of money. So when you're talking of energy, solar and all that, they will rather you be foot soldiers than you being on the table. It's like politics. They will rather the women go and shout outside for them than be in the room where the decisions are going to be made. So we need to understand this unconscious bias, and we need to get male champions in and let them know that we are in this together. And women also need to stop being in the room when we are disenfranchising men, because the moment we have women allies as well with the men trying to be gatekeepers, we are in trouble. So that's it. And we talked about it in the last conference, if you remember.
Yes.
We actually need to understand that there are some women that are really our gatekeepers, and there are a lot of men that are our friends, and they need to be with us, and we need to fight this thing. Don't come out saying you want to remove the men in the room. Let them know that we are in this together. Because if you think you are going to take them out, they're going to fight you. Which is what they've been doing.
Yes, and we don't want that. We want to move forward holding
No.
hands. Exactly.
Yes.
So looking kind of in the longer term view, this is another question that has come up from Sandra Medina, and it's a little bit of a vague question about accessing impact in the long term, but I'm going to invite Paula and Isabel into the conversation as well. We could look at it from the lens of allyship. We could look at it from the lens of sort of a sustained or sustainable effort to bring more women into the room and have a seat at the table. So I'm just going to invite your comments as well. Whoever wants to go first. Isabel, you came
Hi,
off.
Camille. I just wanted to add that, we also need to not see it as like winners are losers. I think everyone can be winning. The growing economy, blue and green economy, and the industry is so big that to take the full advantage of that, we can all be winning. And I think it's also about thinking multisectorally, right? It's not only about the technical capacity, as you said, but it's like what is the package of interventions that makes this viable? As you know, also Paula highlighted all the different angles that surround these disadvantages for women. So it's the technical capacity plus the financing, plus the business development, plus the access to markets. Like, what are all the things that need to happen? What is the whole chain of support systems that needs to happen that will actually generate change?
You need to think about this holistically. And in order to do that, you need to work, the people that are working on the different pieces of it need to come together and have conversations about developing solutions.
Yeah. When I was at the World Bank, I actually was working with the Gender Action Plan. And I always remember their slogan, which I still always think back to. And it's like, gender economics is smart economics. So you don't have to do it because you think it's a good thing. It's just a smart business decision.
Yeah, exactly. Paula, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think I'm just adding to that. I think it's a perfect segue because I was going to say that, I think the biggest thing that I've seen throughout just my work on gender issues over last 15 years with the World Bank, and I think the understanding has grown so much in terms of the importance, and a big part of it has been having evidence and making the case and ensuring that across the board people understand that it is a win-win, right? So as Isabel mentioned, that it's smart economics to ensure that women are included in all of these areas, right? And again, we work as the World Bank, we work directly with finance ministers, with private sector leaders who are often men, and having the evidence, having some of these arguments, and ensuring that everyone understands the importance and that it is not a win-lose equation, it's a win-win equation, has been, I think, a huge factor in getting more traction, and especially male allies to come into the equation. The unconscious bias is a huge aspect of it that I think we all need to recognize, right? And it's not just from men, it's from men and women. And I work on some of these areas, looking at social norms. How do we change some of these cultural and social biases that are implicit and that really drive and kind of I think lead to persistent inequalities in some of these areas. And looking at, I think, longer term, when you think about this, it's changing. It's changing the conversation, changing the mindset is one. Then looking at how can you make sure that women are included in all of these areas, and then assessing the impact. We'll be seeing how much we're making these changes, right? Ensuring that finance is going to women-led SMEs, and how much of that, and that's tracking that. How much women are really being able to be part of these male-dominated sectors, the ones that will be kind of highly involved in the green transition, ensuring that women's leadership is really part of the decision-making, and their voices are heard in the policy decisions that are made and the investment decisions that are made. I think these are some of the areas that we should be tracking, looking at the impact longer term.
And Emily Neal, who is a recruiter from DT Global, actually has a very specific practical question in the chat. And I think it'll be the last question we take before we get ready to wrap that up. 2-minute warning is what can they do? What can companies do in their hiring processes to ensure that more women are included in job opportunities coming up in the blue and green economies?
Let me answer that.
Okay.
Care economy. We discussed that at the last.
Yes, we did. And it was a great conversation.
We need to fund, and as a recruiter, you need to push all the companies that you work for to support the care economy. That is what is removing women from the workplace. There's nothing else. Women love money. all want money and we all want to be at the big league, but we care for our homes before we care for any other thing. If you don't fund the care economy, the women will leave the offices and stay at home, and they will sacrifice that 10 years and come back later. So we need to if you want to diversify the workplace, just fund for the care economy, fund that sector. Because if you can put a pool table in the room, if you can put a soundproof game room in the office, you can put a soundproof breastfeeding room in the office. It is important for us to understand. We keep going round and round this thing as if it's one special intervention we're looking at. We all know that disability leaves the woman at home. She's going to care for her disabled child before she comes to the office. She's going to feed her children before she comes to the office. So, and she, the menstrual cycle and all that. So let's fund the care economy.
So I think that we're out of time, but I want to just basically invite my colleague Lita to pop a link in the chat to the Blue and Green Economy white paper that we produced from our event last month. It's got all sorts of amazing links to public and private resources and some recommendations on what public and private institutions can do. And, you can also reach out to us directly at WE, which stands for Women's Empowerment, at counterpart.org. We could have easily kept going with this conversation for another hour, but I just really want to thank our panelists, Saudat and Isabel and Paola, so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience does too. And so do the organizers of the SID conference. This was an important chapter in what is going to be a continuing dialogue. I see that Lita has popped a link in the chat, and Isabel has responded to you with some cool resources that you can check out. I just love it when conversations like this start to pop off online, because they create opportunities for us to continue the conversation and to come together at a later date. And I really appreciate all of the ideas and solutions that were generated here today. I've taken a few notes, and we will leverage this to continue our good work in this sector. So thank you very much. And everyone have a wonderful Friday and a fabulous weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ben.